Madam President.
Senator from Rhode Island.
Madam President, I rise today to salute a hometown hero, a dedicated journalist, and a trusted newsman, Jim Taricani, who sadly passed away last month after decades of contributions to Rhode Island and the field of journalism throughout this country. This is just an example of the tributes that he won by a very, very enthusiastic population in Rhode Island. This is the front page of the Providence Journal on the day of his funeral services. He was a gentleman. He was a man of integrity, a man of fairness, the qualities that define a great journalist. In fact, great journalist and Jim Taricani are synonymous. He leaves behind an extraordinary legacy. He was an award-winning investigative journalist who earned multiple Emmys and the coveted Edward R. Murrow Award. And he was a true champion of the First Amendment. Jim grew up in Connecticut and served in the United States Air Force, where he was stationed in Europe as a military police officer. But he made his mark when he moved to Rhode Island and embarked on a career in broadcast journalism, first in radio, and then over a 30-year career at WJAR that spanned from the late 1970s through 2014. Jim began his stint for NBC 10, WJAR, as a general assignment reporter, but gained notoriety for covering big stories and uncovering the truth. And he went on to found the station's investigative team in 1979. He earned a reputation for taking on tough stories about organized crime and political corruption. And in reporting on these difficult topics, Jim's own integrity, selflessness, and fairness shone through every day, every moment. Indeed, Jim didn't just talk about principles, he lived them. In February 2001, Jim obtained an FBI surveillance video from a confidential source. It showed a public employee accepting a bribe in the famed Operation Plunderdome case, which transfixed Rhode Island and Providence, its capital, for many, many months. It marked a significant moment where people could see and hear what corruption looked like. But rather than following a court order to reveal the source of the tape, Jim stood up for the First Amendment, and he was sentenced to 6 months of home confinement. Several of Jim's friends and colleagues wrote letters to the judge on Jim's behalf, including Christina Amapour, who interned for Jim in the early 1980s when she was a student at URI. She noted that Jim Taricani taught her, in her words, that journalism, when done right, is a noble profession, that America's unique commitment to freedom of the press is vital to a functioning democracy, and that holding public officials to account is the imperative of a corruption-free society. Indeed, that is what Jim set out to do through his reporting. And he became a strong advocate for other journalists, testifying before Congress about freedom of the press and the challenges journalists face in trying to keep the public informed about their government. His help, his actions, his activity spurred action. The Senate Judiciary Committee advanced Senator Schumer's bipartisan Media Shield bill. But the work to protect journalists and ensure that they can responsibly do their job and inform the public continues. We must find a bipartisan way forward that balances freedom of the press and public safety. Jim was also a tremendous advocate for the American Heart Association. A survivor of cardiovascular disease and multiple heart attacks, Jim documented his own process undergoing a heart transplant from uncertainty to recovery. Here's how the Providence Journal's television critic described it. Listed, the title refers to the word from doctors that every heart transplant candidate longs to hear, is the most powerful human interest story I have ever seen on local television. It is courageous first-person journalism, a story that you may never forget. Jim, who kept a diary throughout his hospital stay, wanted to have his experience videotaped in order to produce a donor awareness video for the American Heart Association. It was never his intention to broadcast the account, but when news director Dan Salamone suggested it would reach a broader audience if televised, Taricani agreed. That was Jim. Not looking to be the story, but willing to share his story if it could help others. Thoughtful, tenacious, and tough. That was Jim Taricani. And by the way, 32 days after receiving his new heart, Jim was back at work, which tells you everything you need to know about how passionate he was about journalism and how much he loved his job. But undoubtedly, the love of his life was his wife, Lori White, who is a force in her own right and has taken up Jim's cause of freedom of the press and encouraging the next generation of aspiring young journalists to go out and make a difference. She has endowed a lecture series on First Amendment rights at the University of Rhode Island in Jim's honor, which is a fitting tribute. Journalists bring sunlight to the stories that otherwise may stay hidden in the shadows. It is my hope that this lecture series will continue his legacy of inspiring the next generation of ethical and responsible journalists. She said that. I expect the series will help increase public understanding of the importance of a free press and the First Amendment for decades to come. As a journalist, as a person, nothing stopped Jim from following the facts, uncovering the truth, sharing important stories, and enlightening his audience. We are all in Rhode Island and across the country deeply saddened by the loss of Jim Taricani. But his example and legacy endure. That legacy will sustain us and inspire us and continue on our work together to build a just and decent country. And for that, for Jim, we are all grateful. And Madam President, I would yield the floor to my distinguished colleague from Rhode Island, Senator Whitehouse.
Madam President.
Senator from Rhode Island.
It is a great honor to join my senior colleague, Senator Reid, here on the Senate floor together to remember someone we both knew very well, Jim Taricani, a legendary investigative reporter who not only we knew well, but who so many Rhode Islanders knew well. If there was a rule in Rhode Island, when Jim called, you answered. He was always tough. He was always fair. He was the founder of WJAR's I-Team, a storied investigative unit for the NBC affiliate in Rhode Island. Jim started working as a reporter in the 1970s when the New England Mafia was still active on the streets of Providence. He became known for segments exposing organized crime and for sniffing out public corruption, and at times a bit of a combination of both. Jim's news sense and his doggedness were legendary. Jim was a Rhode Island icon. In a small state with more than its share of stories to tell and plenty of larger-than-life characters, investigative journalists have always had a particular prominence. For more than 3 decades, Jim was among the best of them all. He was brave. When a federal judge ordered Jim to divulge who had provided him with a tape of a bribe being accepted at Providence City Hall, he opted for a prison sentence rather than give up his source. The courage of Jim Taricani made national headlines. He ended up serving 4 months of home confinement and testified before Congress in 2007 in support of a federal shield law to protect the freedom of the press. Rhode Islanders felt a personal connection to Jim for another reason. Jim needed a new heart in the 1990s after having suffered 2 heart attacks in his 30s. He shared this health saga on the air, allowing WJAR cameras to follow along as he underwent a heart transplant and navigated his recovery. From living rooms and kitchen tables across Rhode Island, Rhode Islanders rooted for Jim as his health improved and ultimately he returned to the newsroom. The transplant would give him 23 more years, which he called his bonus. Jim passed away last month at the age of 69. With the free press under more strain than almost any other point in our nation's history, Jim's funeral became a really important moment. The photo that Senator Reid just showed on the front page of the Providence Journal the next day was a sight to behold. More than 50 journalists showed up to serve as Jim Taricani's honor guard. The honor guard had dozens of reporters from across Rhode Island, not just from WJAR, but from all of its competitors, too. Journalists came from other parts of the country who had crossed paths with Jim at Channel 10 during time they spent in Rhode Island. They had come back to see off a friend, a hero, and a staunch defender of the First Amendment. I join Senator Reid today in thinking of Jim's beloved wife, Lori White, and the many friends of theirs who mourn Jim's passing. He will, Madam President, be missed. I yield the floor.